Awesome. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. And thanks you to everyone who's, I see that Andre, should I admit him there, Shona? Oh, great. Thanks to everyone who's joining this morning. It's going to be a little bit of a different program. We're excited to bring a little bit of a methods discussion to everyone through our town hall, just from some of the interactions that we've been having and questions people have been asking. So today we're going to have a little bit of an update, central update. I'll just do really quickly. I'll just remind people of some of the resources that we have available, which most of you on the call know, but just a quick reminder. And then some of the working groups have been having some what we call specific issues or questions, just methodological discussions that they want to go through or have discussions about within their working group. So Worker Productivity has volunteered, thank you very much, have volunteered to sort of present their methods work on the construct validity and then to ask their question. And then Dorcas is going to review for us our gold, silver and bronze levels of validation. And then we're also hopefully have time, if there are other questions within the general sort of working group questions that people have, we hope to have time then to go through that. So just a reminder that we're excited. Can you believe that it's like not that far away? So that just to remind people about the meeting in Turkey on May 14th to the 18th, and the groups are going to be working hard in the next year. Amazing, to sort of get ready for that. And also a lot of work in the background going on with the groups who are going to be running their SIGs, their virtual SIGs and voting. And it's amazing. So a lot of work happening. So thanks to everyone. Just some of the resources, just a reminder about that, because some people have asked me about some of the additional things. You know about the handbook and workbook, but I'm always excited about OMERED. And I always tell all the working groups now, but this wonderful resource that we have, that Shauna really led the development of these online e-learning modules. And the working groups, when I tell them, they're like, oh, this is great, because, you know, they can get the history of OMERACT in there, plus they can, when they're working in their domain selection, they can watch that e-learning module or the instrument selection. And also the patient partnership one is amazing. We also have a new peers framework that on the patient engagement piece. So we're going to present that probably in the next couple of months to you as well. And we can talk about that and the facilitating. So these OMERED e-learning modules are really, really exciting for people. So make sure that you share those with your groups, because when I'm on there, they're like, oh, I have no idea. I didn't hear about that. So make sure you do share those with your groups and that they're working their way through that, and they have trouble, let us know. Just lots of stuff going on the website as well. We're updating, as you know, some of the chapters, but there's also other things on there, like all the work that you just did on our conference in Colorado Springs. All those proceedings will be added, or the, additional articles will be added to that. And then the newsletter is awesome, gets monthly newsletters, have a lot in them. So make sure that you share those as well with your groups. And the wonderful glossary. So just any questions on that? Otherwise, I'll send it over to Casper and Andre to sort of start the presentation and discussion around construct validity. Nope. Awesome. I'll stop sharing. And Andre, are you going first or Casper? Andre, probably.
I'm going for it. I'll share my screen.
Okay, I want to make sure that you have. Great. Thank you.
Can you see the slide? Okay.
Perfect.
Well, thank you. In the name of the group, the Work Productivity Group, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to show the work we've been doing over the past 3 years, I guess, and even more than that, the work that was done before us. We joined the team. Today, briefly, we are going to talk about a brief introduction to the concepts, the main concepts we are working with when in our group as worker productivity and presenteeism, and the challenges that we countered when assessing specifically the construct validity issue in the presenteeism measuring instruments. So starting work productivity, we in the literature and all researches, we saw two components, which are absenteeism when the worker is not at work, and presenteeism when the worker is at work, but as if it was not. So the decreasing in the ability to perform their tasks, and also to perform a decrease in their productivity. And both components, they are part of a continuum depending on the health status of the worker and the impact of the disease on their ability and also productivity. We can understand the worker has a choice of going to work or not. And then this phenomena of absenteeism or presenteeism take back. And many authors hypothesize that the transition goes back and forth depending on the health status. So our focus is mostly on presenteeism, but it's not possible to understand presenteeism without also understanding absenteeism and this continuum. But talking about presenteeism, it refers to the consequences of being at work while sick, which can be defined as decreased ability to perform tasks, mainly in the worker's perspective, or in the actual decrease in work productivity or the work output, being products or services due to health problems, usually in the societal and employer perspective. So the hypothesis of the main model is that the decreasing work ability translates into decreasing productivity. We also have many measurements, which they have the index version. We'll talk about WLQ, which has this objective of translating decreasing productivity as a consequence of decreasing ability. So presenteeism itself is defined as in the core area of life impact of disease. I'm just trying to fix things here. Okay, the broad domain is defined as socioeconomic impact of disease on worker productivity. And the target domain, we defined this table, it was in the workbook, and it's part of the domain definition. So presenteeism at work productivity, defined as productivity loss during paid work due to health, and the presenteeism also ability. We included both definitions. As ability, we defined as the impaired ability to perform tasks while working due to health-related cause. The working definition, well, I ask for permission to read briefly this. I think it's something good to make sure to the group to understand how we defined it. So presenteeism refers to the consequences of being present at work while sick, which can be defined as decreased ability to perform tasks or the actual decrease in work output due to health. Includes limitations or decreasing ability to perform tasks, which results in decreased productivity. And in the literature, the data we have to support these definitions is that presenteeism is a predictor of work disability. However, few employment interventions have preventive approach. Few services exist targeting employment issues in arthritis. The societal costs of presenteeism, also named indirect costs of disease, constitute a large part of the economic burden of rheumatic musculoskeletal disorders, the cost of illness for patients and society, and despite a better control of disease activity by optimizing treatment targets, employment issues require specific management strategies. Controlling disease activity didn't completely solve the problem of presenteeism. In the literature, we have many different types of instruments. We have multi-item, which are based on many questions and the scoring system, or more based on global measures, which are similar to the VAS or a numeric rating scale, with a broader approach to the measurement. Previously, the group along the last decade conducted a systematic review of studies that used patient-reported indicators of presenteeism for validation, psychometric properties, and discriminating properties in RCTs, for example. All the qualitative work on surveys on work, presenteeism, and measurement properties discussed in the OMERACT workshops during meetings. And based on the first part of the work, 6 instruments out of 20 were selected as the most promising candidates. It's important to say that for presenteeism, we don't have a gold standard. So all this work is being performed without having one gold standard as a comparator for example, construct validity. 2 of these 6 instruments passed the OMERACT filter and were endorsed with more than 70% support of WPI and WPS RA at OMERACT 11. And 4 instruments are still remaining for OMERACT endorsement. The phases of domain match and feasibility have been already performed, and it passed. It has evidence that it passes the criteria. So the remaining instruments, the 4 remaining instruments are WALS, WLQ 25 with a modification in the physical domain, WAI, workability index, and QQ, quantity and quality method. The first are multi-item, and the last 2 global measurements. So now we did perform recently a systematic review on these 4 instruments in a broader population with rheumatic disease. On WLQ, which was the instrument that had more papers published. So we started by WLQ. And in the SIG in Colorado, we presented our preliminary SOMP table. We are still refining the search process and the quality assessment of papers, but we already have good evidence in the literature to focus on construct validity and clinical trial discrimination. Today we'll focus on construct validity. I'll pass to Casper.
Yes, thank you, Andre, and thank you for the very nice introduction to the concept that we're trying to measure. Perhaps you could go back 1 slide back to the SOMP table.
Sure.
Because as you will notice, most of the evidence that we encountered related to the construct validity and to the clinical trial discrimination. And those were also 2 of the measurement properties that we focused on during our SIG discussion in Colorado last year. And for today, we'll be focusing on the construct validity. And I think important here is to note that if you just look at our SOMP table, and especially the construct validity, it seems as if we're there for this instrument. I mean, we have multiple greens, we have a few ambers, a few reds, which we'll not take into account due to insufficient methodological quality. But even though it seems as if we're passing the filter for this instrument regarding construct validity, we still want to discuss this a bit further because there were several challenges that we encountered while doing this review. And we also like to hear everyone's thoughts on how to proceed further with this. We also have some plans for ourselves. We have them on the final slide, but I suggest we do not show them yet, so we can first have a bit of a discussion and then afterwards discuss what our plans are. So if you can go to the next one, Andre, and then the one after that, because I just mentioned this. So I think everyone here knows generally how construct validity is assessed, and also in general in literature. And of course, this is all about what an instrument should measure and what it should not measure. So in our case, WLQ25 should measure presenteeism. So that is what it should measure and should not measure, for example, maybe absenteeism. And typically one of the ways this is done is by comparing the instrument scores, in our case, the WLQ25 scores, with scores in other instruments that are either measuring similar or dissimilar constructs. And important here is, of course, that there are a priori hypotheses formulated on what kind of relationship you would expect, based on the relationship between the construct that we're measuring, presentism, and the construct that one of those other external instruments is measuring. And there are basically three challenges that we often encounter while doing this review, and I put them at the bottom. The first of all was that although we have several studies that assess the construct validity of the WLQ20 in the population of interest, so in people with RMDs, we thought there could be a potential discrepancy between the external constructs that have been used in literature and constructs that we thought might be relevant when looking at an instrument such as the WLQ25, or should be considered convincing. The second one is often that a priori hypotheses were lacking, so not formulated at all, or only more like posterior hypotheses sometimes. And third is that there were, we encountered at some point in time, several times, that there were variations in hypotheses between studies. I'll show an example later on. So if you can go to the next one. And for the first one, I put it here as a question. We also put this question forward during our SIG discussion last year in Colorado. And basically the idea was to get an impression of what people, when they think about presentism as a concept, as a construct, and think, okay, I want to have an instrument that should measure presentism, but on which kind of external construct should or should it not be related with? So which kind of construct would you ideally see in studies to assess the construct validity of this instrument? And if we go to the next slide, what you see here is we put several constructs that came up during discussion in different categories. Constructs that are mentioned in black are ones that we also encountered in literature. So for example, disability on the top left, there were one or multiple studies that compared the instrument scores on WLQ25 with instrument scores that assess disability with some hypothesis, and several other black ones as well. But all the blue ones are basically constructs that came up during the discussion that people felt, okay, if you have a presentism instrument, and I want to be convinced that it has good or sufficient construct validity, then these are the kind of constructs that I want them to be compared with to make sure what is my instrument measuring and what is it not measuring. And this is something that we also discussed within our group. And of course, this is partially a bit perhaps a hypothetical situation, because there's, of course, you have a bit of a balance between what is feasible, what is not feasible. You cannot expect all of these constructs to be tested in literature against your construct that you're interested in. But it still was something that we came up and we thought like, okay, should there perhaps be something of a minimal set of constructs? So if you're looking at an instrument that is measuring construct A, should there then be several constructs that you think, okay, these should be I've used as external construct before I'm convinced that my instrument is measuring what I think it is measuring. But in the end, that's one of the questions I think for discussion today. And if you can go to the next one, Andre. And again, it's more of a hypothetical situation typically, but still it came up. Then the other two questions, the other two challenges that came up were, okay, what of our hypotheses in the studies that we included, what, and they are not predefined. We saw that up to half of the included studies in some way did not mention any hypothesis. And generally then we made an impression of our own, like what would we expect in these situations? And third, what if hypotheses are implausible weak, or maybe even more importantly, what if they vary between studies? So for example, typically we see in several of these studies that there is some hypothesis on the relationship between the WLQ, our instrument, and its expected correlation with the SF36 roll scores. But we also see variation between studies without any justification or any clear reason why you would expect different hypotheses. And then the question is, okay, how should we approach this? Should we then assume, okay, we just look at it by study and follow the hypotheses of each individual study? Or is there maybe a reason to sometimes overrule the original hypotheses put forward by the original authors if we disagreed? And I think those we can stop sharing now. I think those were the parts that we wanted to discuss today. So again, should there be several external constructs that might be, how do you handle it if not all external constructs that you feel relevant have been used? What if hypotheses are not predefined? And what if hypotheses for certain constructs, certain external constructs, what if they vary between individual studies? How should we handle this? I think this is what we wanted to discuss briefly.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do we want to have questions first, Dorcas, before we move on? I think that'll be good if we just have some general questions to Andre and Casper.
Oh, yes, let's have these discussions for sure.
Right. So the floor is open.
So I'm sorry, I missed your SIG at the meeting, but I just have sort of a basic question for you, which is if you have two instruments that you have already taken through the filter, why do you need to do 4 more instruments to take them through the filter? When one of the ultimate purposes of thinking about instruments is an issue of parsimony and trying to find something that people can agree to use in clinical trials so that your results may be comparable among clinical trials. You're not working on developing any type of crosswalk between these instruments, but you're trying to show that each one of these instruments may be able to be used in some way. But it seems like a lot of work is being done for multiple different instruments that you have identified. And I guess the question is, do you want to look at all of those and then try to define what is the quote unquote best of all of those that you would decide upon and try to say that that's going to be the one that you're going to try to harmonize everyone around? Because, it seems like if you have, 6 instruments that you say pass the filter, that doesn't really advance us very much in saying, then what should be used in a clinical trial? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if we are working on trials, we want something that a regulatory authority or an agency will agree that is a measure that can be qualified for use in the setting of a clinical trial. And again, the standards for that qualification may require different things than what you have presented through the OMRAC filter.
Casper or Andre or one of the other group members? And respond to Bing. Annalise, do you want to reply to Bing? Is that awesome?
I'm happy to give it a try. That's Casper and all the others can complete me. That's one. I think it's a very important question, which I also asked myself several times. First of all, for the WLQ, it's the first one that is multidimensional, and that's really different from the global measures, because in specific work interventions, then you want to know whether work improves on several aspects, such as output demands and the personal demands, as distinguished in the WLQ. So I think that that's a fair argument to mention that we would like to have not only a global measure that measures very implicit aspects, but a specific multidimensional instrument. And the second issue, if you have one, why continue, that I find more difficult. I thought that OMRAC wants to have a database of all instruments that in rheumatic diseases or in your disease of interest are valid for use. And I never understood that we should bring forward one instrument for a specific domain. And if we would do that, then I wonder how we are going to decide that we have the best instruments. So then you still should test all or at least you should look at all the instruments, and then we come to the issue of comparative validity of all the patient global work productivity instruments, which is not something that we are used to do. And if we do it, we have a lot of problems with it. If the correlation of instrument A versus B is 10%, is there that 10% difference in correlation, is then the constructs validity different. So that's my partial answer and or my reflections on this.
Great, thank you. Dorcas, do you want to reply, or Suzanne and Robin have their hands up? Robin first.
It's not directly related to what's just being mentioned now, but it's my reflection of the lovely presentation. I consider myself an inexperienced person for the following answer, but I think I personally would like to have generic criteria or criterion validity. Since we don't have criterion validity in this business, I would be very keen on using SF36, as somebody would call it, a legacy instrument. So if you have one of the 8 subdomains that makes sense to some of you, then I think I would appreciate using that as a standard, not an anchor, but construct to go up against. Because remember, the reason we take in new measurements and instruments is because they are better. So it's not scary when the correlation is not always good. It could mean, as long as the direction is good enough, I don't have any comments about the magnitude, but as long as they go with the measurement that people out there think they understand. That's how I see SF36. That would be my comment. SF36 is a legacy instrument. So I think since we already know what that is, I think it would make sense to use those as generic constructs.
Dorcas, you want to reply to that, and then Suzanne?
We've done, there's a fair amount on the role functioning, especially for work and work productivity, and the SF36 isn't doing so very well in discriminating in that. Their role functioning scales aren't as strong as some of their other subscales. I was just going to put a note in the chat that traditionally OMRAT is focused on whether or not instruments pass the filter. I think you guys are going to be commenting on, so we don't usually do which one's the best instrument, but we like to have at least one instrument that's passed the filter. And I think, Suzanne, you might comment on some of your global experiences with global measures, which are making us sort of pursue some of the multi-item measures in a bit more detail. But also that the ones that went through were more productivity oriented. So some of the new globals, like the WAI, was picking up the ability, the difficulty oriented. So I'll let Suzanne continue with that, because she can certainly.
Great, Suzanne, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I think it's 2 things. If you would just focus on one, for example, the WPAI, that was the first measurement that went through the filter. That's a very old measurement. So that if you would only have one measurement, then that would mean the oldest measurement, and then you don't have to search anymore. But we developed these measurements based on the experience with using some of these measurements. So I think we do need to look at all the different ones. And we already narrowed it down due to different groups work that was going on from almost like 20 instruments to 6 instruments. So there is a rationale where we only focus on 6 and not 20 as such. So that's quite important to know. And I think, like Dorcas said, there are some slight differences. So it might be that we're not going to say in the end, okay, this is the best instrument, but there might be studies where you say you really would be better to use a global one focusing on ability, or multi-item one focusing on productivity. That might be depending on the perspective of the study, societal, employers. So there are some slight nuances where you may recommend one instrument above the other one. So that's sort of coming based on some of your comments, Bing, as well.
Great. No, that's really helpful. Thank you so much for the clarification. I didn't really realize that difference. I guess that was missing in the introduction, and also just part of my lack of familiarity with the field of recognizing that the work had been on sort of, you're dealing with 2 separate constructs, I guess, in some ways that you're trying to measure. So you obviously, you would need instruments that would have a domain match with one versus a domain match with the other. If in fact, I mean, I guess my understanding then is that you have sort of you have two different areas that are subsumed under this larger sort of meta domain, right? In terms of productivity being your sort of meta domain, and then you have these subdomains that would be that you're trying to look at instruments that may be able to reflect the two different components of that. Is that,
Yeah, it's quite broad. Yeah. So when
is that a fair,
we
is
were
that a fair?
talking, yeah.
Okay,
Because
so I
sorry.
apologize for my original comment then, because that's where I was just very confused. So that gives me great clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, because maybe Andre, if you can go back to the domain definition table, because I think we struggled a bit indeed. Like, should we then call it presenteeism and then have these ability or productivity like sub definitions in there, or should it be like really two different tables? Like in the target domain, here we put indeed like the productivity at work productivity decrease or the at work impaired work ability, and those are indeed like the two that kind of not dichotomy might be a bit too much, but indeed the two directions. Indeed, and the question is, should it even be two different tables?
It might be clear even just with what Bing was encountering with like it made it much clearer when he understood that they were sort of two related, but they're going to perform and function differently if you're talking about workability and your work productivity decrease, but they are both part of this higher order, broader concept.
So I guess it would
Maybe
be.
this is like, sorry, this
Yeah.
is this slide could help a little. It was in a previous Omeract paper.
Yeah, so I think what it shows here is indeed both a combination of the two different different constructs perhaps, or like the sub constructs, let's call them that, ability and productivity, and then also a different way of measuring them as a multi-item versus a global measure.
And strictly productivity, I think presenteeism could be the umbrella term, and productivity is something that you preferably use to assess the cost, the dollars or the euros. While ability is more how the patient feels this impacting work, how the disease impacts work.
I guess it would also be good to sort of continue some of that conversation around the construct validity, and some of the questions that Casper and Andre had. I mean, you already mentioned that SF36 would be a really good sort of measure to link it in. But if you go back to those questions, Andre, sort of, yeah. So especially like the second and the third question, what would people do if the hypothesis is not predefined, which does happen quite a lot, but also if there are some differences in if there's a hypothesis included between the different studies. And I don't know if anybody else has experienced something very similar within their own work in their groups.
Many people have encountered that, especially the third one. So I wonder if anybody else if anybody's been involved with the other groups, has any suggestions about what you've done when there's been no hypotheses in the article.
I think Loretta. Oh, sorry, Robin was first.
Should I start?
Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
I was just curious, maybe for a quick comment from some of you. From a Cochrane perspective, we keep talking about selective outcome reporting, meaning that our colleagues have been quote unquote cheating or changed their mind after seeing data and stuff. Do we have any experience or suspicion that people in psychometrics, they try to tweak it or cheat at the final stage and say, therefore, this correlates with this and not this? So is there a reason that we are suspicious, like the Cochrane way, like we usually are in terms of bias? So it's an open question, because if we think that people are doing good psychometrics, why should we then just allow them to change their constructs just to make a point?
When are they changing their constructs, Robin? Can you help me understand when they've changed? Give me when the constructs
so
change.
given that we read their final paper, and then they say, as the third point up here is suggesting, so the hypothesis was that there should be a strong correlation or association, but by the end of the day, it was not present there. That would just be a legitimate claim of them being transparent. But same thing could happen for the exact same study if people didn't admit, because the protocols are so terrible, that they actually did quite a few potential constructs, meaning association tests, before deciding on what to put into a paper. So that's why. So do we suggest, or do we have any evidence to think that psychometricians are cheating like trialists are doing? And we have evidence for that latter part.
I think that will be really hard to know, because this will be all behind the doors, and of course that's not something you're going to write into your manuscript. So I think we just need to think that people are honest in what they write and have those hypotheses beforehand. But I think there's no way we can figure that out.
No, and it's probably the older papers, as being said before, we had clear guidance that we had to specify. Yeah. But when we encounter this problem, doing the systematic review of the instruments in vasculitis, which were lots of them, after reviewing 3 papers where there were no hypotheses, we decided to stop and then ourselves decide which were the best hypotheses, and then use that as the anchor, so to say. So if our hypothesis for that specific instrument would be this, then what they got. So if they compare to an instrument that for us will have no relation, or will have the opposite relation, then we will say this is shit. Okay? Because in all the instruments that we read, everything was fine. Whatever the correlation, whatever the instrument they compared it with. So we specify the hypothesis ourselves, just in case they didn't.
Thank you, Annelies.
Sorry, can I just briefly comment? So Loretta, how did you come up with those hypotheses? Based on your expertise or based on some previous research? Because that was a discussion we had as well. If that was something we're going to do, go ahead. Are we going to do a survey amongst experts, or how did you come up with those hypotheses?
So actually, when I saw the list of potential constructs, I said, this is perfect. This is what I would have done. See, to just think, if this is an instrument measuring this type of presentism, then it should go like this. So it's based on expertise. We had good experts on vasculitis, so we said, how should it behave? So yeah.
Yeah.
Annelies? Oh, you're muted, Annelies. Wonderful things coming out, but you're muted.
I'm not sure it's wonderful, but anyway, we did the same with AXPA. So we defined the hypothesis ourselves within a smaller group, or the steering group, so to say. But then we saw very large variation. So we were initially blinded for each other. And it has a lot to do whether we think of correlations in terms of the constructs, in terms of our knowledge of the instruments and knowledge on the published literature. So, for example, a measure of inflammation, BAS-DAI or ASDAS, what is your expectation that it correlates with MRI inflammation? Theoretically, inflammation is inflammation, and you would expect a good correlation. But many persons know that there is a bad correlation, at maximum moderate if you are lucky. So that was also a big discussion of, do you take into account your knowledge, or do you look your knowledge also about the instrument? One instrument is an MRI, and the other instrument is partly self-reported, partly with a CRP. Do you take into account all that, or are you making your hypothesis based on the constructs that underlie the instruments?
Thank you. Casper?
Yeah, my first point was indeed the point Annelies just made, like how do you think about the instrument or the constructs? And the second one was more, I think, for Loreto in your exercise also, did you then also overrule the original authors? Or did you just say, I have these hypotheses that we as a group made kind of as a backup in case they don't formulate any, but if they do report any, we just
Yeah.
follow the authors?
Yeah, exactly. So if they didn't have a hypothesis, then we will use ours and then look at the paper with our eyes, not.
Yes, yes. So, but if they did report any, then you use the ones they reported, right? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
thank you.
Marcus?
Really helpful discussion. And a question that I had is if the groups are setting out their own hypotheses a priori, sorry, if the groups are having to define the a priori hypotheses that are in these studies in the published literature, there's always going to be a temptation or a risk that you might see the results of the study and then formulate your working groups, well, what should we see in this situation? And that's just going to be a risk, and it might be one we want to avoid. So then I was wondering whether could the exercise, and I think you were getting to some of the responses are getting to that too, but could the exercise be set up so that it's done before you look at the studies, assuming that you're going to encounter literature which does not have a priori, because it sounds like we are all encountering that, and then do these set of surveys or exercises, and then you'd have a table of your a prioris, then you start looking into your studies. And maybe that's a table that OMRAT could also be sharing. And then along with that, what if they put sort of not great hypotheses in their study, or they're doing a whole bunch of comparisons and haven't really thought them through, and yet that then is available evidence and construct validity. And one thing at the ISOCLAW meeting, they were talking about this, and they were saying they're actually prioritizing some of the constructs so that if you had a priority, if there was a workability question, then that's going to be a priority for your comparisons as opposed to a correlation with SED rate and work productivity, because they're so disparately related. So you might get some for, I don't expect there to be a relationship between this and this. But anyway, just so the two things would be doing it a priori and having a set of hypotheses before you even look at the literature. And should we be sort of ranking the order of the types of constructs we want to see?
Awesome. Thank you. Robin? And
I
then,
just wanted to mention I had a framework analogy that might be helpful. As I remember, and maybe I forgot, Bev, if you're a co-author of Robin's Eye, in which case I apologize. But the idea from if you want to assess risk of bias and credibility of a cohort study in what's called a non-randomized studies of intervention study, then the Robin's Eye instrument actually explicitly says that which confounders to deconfound for, so to say, or which cohorts to trust, which have adjusted for the right covariance, should not be judged by the cohort people, but that should be part of the a priori protocol for the systematic reviewers who plan to condense and combine all the previous cohorts. So I think we have at least we're always looking for helping existing documents. So in terms of a framework we can lean towards, I think Robin's Eye's experience is they took the lead on that, saying like Miguel Anand from Harvard, this causality diagram person, he said he put a lot of emphasis, and that's also why it's a little bit tricky and complicated to read. But people need to do the thinking in their systematic review group and put that into a protocol rather than trusting the cohort people publishing it. Just an
Yeah.
analogy.
no, that's awesome. And I'll just add that, yes, I am part of that. And they talk about the target trial, like what would be your ideal trial? And we have a team of experts in confounding within particular areas that then develop that target trial. And then we compare the cohort to that ideal protocol or target trial ahead of time. So a lot of discussion goes in up front. And I like the analogy. That's perfect. Thanks, Robin. I think that's a very good sort of something we can pull out and present and have a discussion about a priori stuff. Yeah, awesome. Dorcas, you're gonna do so we have it's 8:47. So Dorcas, maybe, unless there are other questions or comments, maybe we could present the gold, silver, bronze, validation.
Sure, as long
I
as
have
the-
one final.
Yeah.
Yep, one more, go ahead.
So we conclude, I liked the initial comment from Robin. So then we agree that it might be good to have at least one instrument that we feel that here is really, so if we would have the WLQ and we would have construct validity only with depression or mental health or so, we would say, no, we need at least, well, we need an instrument where the correlation has been done with SF36 or an analogous instrument. I like that idea that you predefine that. I think it's theoretical. I think people that do these validation studies, that they have been thinking about it, but that you have a very minimal instrument where you find this is really, yeah, there should be at least one or two studies where the correlation has been done with that construct or that instrument. Is that fair to conclude, or is that too far? Or shall we ask Casper what he proposes?
No, I agree, actually. I think that was our question also, that we call it a minimum set of constructs. But I think it's the same idea, but then, of course, like instead of a set, we have to keep it feasible, of course. And so I think that's indeed, I think something that we could definitely do. If you go, Andre, just to the final slides, also given the time, just briefly, what we as a group, what we discussed before today, we wanted to, and this of course then up for debate as well, we wanted on the one hand continue our review, but in parallel basically also think about coming up with our own hypotheses for some of the external construct, not every one of them, but indeed, like for example, in SF36, positive life, for example, and then at some point maybe even see what happens if we apply our own hypotheses to these studies instead of following the original authors one, and just as kind of an exercise, see, okay, does that even, would it even change your mind or not at all? So that's just briefly what we intend to do, in addition to everything that came up during today. So that was very, very helpful discussion, at least for me. So thank you.
Dirk mentioned that we can continue because it's a really good discussion and very helpful, I think. So we can continue and then bring the gold, silver, bronze to our next one, if everybody would like to, because I think there's still some other people who may want to ask questions or comment.
There's also some neat discussions. I agree. The absenteeism, presenteeism, the decision of when you go off work that day is a big one, and it's a complex one. So,
yeah.
And then did you also have questions about discrimination, Andre and Casper and the worker productivity gang?
Yeah, we didn't put them in this presentation, but indeed, very briefly, what we discussed during the SIG last year was these kind of outcomes, constructed like outcomes in this context of trials are typically like secondary, even tertiary. Like in large drug trials, typically it's about disease activity or maybe functioning or something like that. But work is typically tends to end up somewhere in the, oh, we also collected this. And then often there's no hypothesis beforehand. And also the challenge then is typically we don't have like a good benchmark. Like if your primary outcome indeed did show, it did improve in the intervention group compared to your comparator group, so let's say disease activity, can you then be sure that the underlying construct, in this case presenteeism, also improved or not? So for example, the WLQ25, if we want to assess a clinical trial discrimination, that's the only presenteeism instrument included in the trial. So we don't have any benchmark that's trying to assess the same construct. How can we then be sure that indeed the underlying construct did improve in the intervention group compared to the comparator group? Oh, sorry. Dorcas,
No, I was going to say, can you run that similar to what the discussion's been going today? Would there be any way to use, reach out to this community and sort of say, okay, so in a clinical trial where their disease activity is improved over the comparison group, would we expect to see more worker productivity or less work difficulties? and see what they would say would be a convincing hypothesis to link to that. Because you're absolutely right. There won't be necessarily a hypothesis unless you are building, unless you have the advantage of being able to put an instrument into a clinical trial, and then you can tag your own global measure or hypothesis into that trial too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think indeed. I think something that came up during the SIG last year when we discussed this, but it was more indeed like, I think general the consensus was that, okay, if your primary outcome is correlated to presenteeism, if the primary outcome construct has been shown to be related to, in this case, presenteeism, then if the primary outcome improved, then you can somewhat safely assume that your presenteeism also improved in the intervention group. I think that was generally the what people came up with, because they were also a bit worried, of course, about patient burden, and how you can only include so many instruments in a trial. So, but that was just what was kind of the consensus back then.
Robin?
It just reminded me also the chat where Lorito is saying we want to speak in positive terms and the counterintuitives and stuff. Remember, we have been struggling with this in osteoarthritis for many years, whether it's called disability or whether it's called function. The whole element of, is it the same thing? So, and it reminds me about the harm/safety group. We're talking about safety, and that's a good side. So I wonder whether this is exact same, for lack of a better term, that it's the inverse association is equally good as the direct association, just to sound technical. Because if it is the inverse, as you might be aware, we talk about pain and disability. They're both bad for osteoarthritis patients, and but we usually measure function. And but in terms of any meta-analysis, we've been using them like for the same purpose, disability and function, of course.
Awesome. So that was really good discussion. Thank you so much for that. I'll just summon Dorcas, you think? Model together.
Maybe what Bev, if it's okay with you and with the others, what we wanted to chat about was that some of the working groups are having difficulty with clinical trial discrimination, exactly what we were just talking about. And so we wanted to reintroduce people to the other options that are available in the handbook and where their biases might be, but they're there and they might be good enough to tell us that this instrument looks like it's going to perform well in a clinical trial. And that might be enough to get it into a clinical trial so you can really test it out. But maybe what I'll do is maybe I'll make up a little video of the little slide deck that I did for that, send it out to people, to the handbook leader, the working groups. You can listen to it before the next session, and then we can come back and sort of ask them questions around it. But please, it won't be the gospel. It's sort of just a reflection of what's in the handbook at this point in time. There might be suggestions to make it better. So that I'd be happy to do that, Bev, if that's a way, just because I'm.
Yeah, that would be really nice. That's excellent. Yeah, because for 5 minutes, I don't want to rush people through it.
And then we'll have that discussion. So there'll be homework for the next town hall.
Yeah, we'll have that discussion for the next town hall, which is March 19th. And just, I had promised that, are there any other general questions within the groups as well? Because we said that there might be other questions that you were waiting to bring forward today. Please feel free now in the next 5 minutes to. No? Awesome.
If things do come up in your groups, please do send them to us ahead of time, because that's what's happened with clinical trial discrimination, is that we've been working with different groups and seeing them challenged by that. So we're happy to dig into an area and bring it back to this type of discussion. If you are having challenges or run into something you want to discuss more, let us know.
Yeah,